Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive crypto heist that honestly completely shattered a lot of our core assumptions about digital security. We're diving deep into the Coldcard exploit, an event that absolutely proved even the most physically impenetrable vaults can be totally compromised by the tiniest invisible flaw written in a few lines of code. All right, let's just jump right into this with a totally staggering number: $38 million. At the time of this exploit, that was roughly 594 Bitcoin. Now, obviously, that's an enormous chunk of money. But what makes this figure truly terrifying isn't just the sheer dollar amount. It's how incredibly quickly and quietly it disappeared from people who genuinely thought they were practicing the absolute gold standard of digital security. Picture this. It's July 30th, 2026. In under half an hour, a sweeping, rapid-fire attack targeted hundreds of wallets. And you have to remember, these weren't careless users clicking sketchy links. These were highly security-conscious people who had locked their wealth in top-tier offline hardware wallets. Some of these devices had literally been sitting dormant in safes for years. And yet, they just sat back and watched their funds vanish without a single trace. So here is the multi-million-dollar question we're going to answer today. How does an attacker pull off a robbery of this scale without ever having physical access to the devices? There was no malware installed on the victim's computers, and absolutely no phishing scams tricking people into handing over their passwords. How on earth do you rob an air-gapped vault, a device that is completely disconnected from the internet, without ever laying a finger on it? To solve this mystery, we first need to get on the same page about the seed phrase. If you're in crypto, you know this is the ultimate root of trust for your entire setup. It's the master key. From this single sequence of 12 or 24 human-readable words, your wallet perfectly derives every single private key and receiving address you're ever going to use. It's pretty simple. If someone else gets these words, they get your money, period. And creating that seed relies entirely on a concept called entropy. Essentially, entropy is the mathematical guarantee that your key was created with pure, unpredictable randomness. When your device generates a seed, it is supposed to pull in a massive amount of chaotic, random data so that the resulting combination of words is literally impossible for anyone else to guess, even if they tried for a billion lifetimes. Well, this right here is where the math literally falls off a cliff. A standard 12-word seed absolutely requires 128 bits of entropy to be secure. But incredibly, due to a fatal firmware bug, that randomness was slashed down to roughly 40 bits on Coldcard MK3 devices and about 72 bits on some later models. To put that into perspective for you, 40 bits of entropy isn't just a little weak. It is so small that a determined attacker with modern computers can literally just brute force guess all the plausible combinations entirely offline. And honestly, the scariest part of this whole thing, it wasn't some sudden overnight hack. A simple configuration error during a library update back in March 2021 basically planted a ticking time bomb inside firmware version 4.0.1. For over 5 years, users were unknowingly generating these tragically weak seeds. It sat completely undetected until July 30, 2026, when the attacker finally detonated it, forcing CoinKite to scramble and push out emergency patches. It is wild to look at exactly how that entropy drops so drastically. Hardware wallets are designed to use a true random number generator, pulling high-quality entropy directly from physical hardware sources. But this specific firmware error, it caused the code to completely bypass the hardware generator. Instead, it fell back on a weak MicroPython software generator, which tried to build randomness using super predictable data, like device chip identifiers and clock timings. It was essentially writing the vault combination in plain sight for anyone who knew where to look. Which brings us to the actual mechanics of the theft. If the hacker never touched the victim's hardware wallets, how did they walk away with the Bitcoin? Well, to understand that, we have to clear up a massive, fundamental misconception about how crypto actually works. You see, your Bitcoin doesn't actually live inside your hardware wallet. The device is just a highly secure keychain that holds your private keys offline. The actual money, recorded as unspent transaction outputs, or UTXOs, just sits out there in the open on the public distributed ledger we all know as the Bitcoin blockchain. The vault itself is totally public. It's just the keys that are private. So, because that entropy was catastrophically low, the attacker didn't need to break into anyone's house. They just used sheer computing power. Step 1, they generated the relatively small pool of weak 40-bit seeds. Step 2, they used those guessed seeds to perfectly reconstruct the victim's private keys. And Step 3, Armed with the keys, they just hopped onto the public blockchain and broadcasted valid transactions, quietly sweeping the money right into their own accounts. Now, here is a fascinating, very modern twist to this whole saga. Coldcard's firmware is open source, which means anyone can read the code. CoinKite actually pointed out a very strong possibility that AI tools helped the attackers spot this vulnerability. Think about it. This was a needle in an open source haystack that human reviewers completely missed for 5 years. But an AI analyzing the code could have easily flagged that bypassed hardware generator, effectively handing the attackers the blueprints to the vault. So, who was actually in the blast radius here? The main victims were folks using single signature wallets generated on firmware versions 4.01 and up. So that covers the MK3, MK4, MK5, and Q devices. But there is a huge silver lining. If you were a user who manually injected your own entropy, like physically rolling dice 50 times, or if you protected your seed with a strong custom passphrase, you are perfectly safe. Your human added randomness totally bridged the gap left by the bug. Oh, and other CoinKite products like the Top Signer, totally different designs, so they were completely unaffected. But for those who didn't use those extra protections, the reality was incredibly harsh. CoinKite issued a very stark warning, and I want to emphasize this because it's crucial. Installing a firmware update does not magically repair an already generated weak seed. The bad math, the total lack of randomness, it is permanently baked right into the DNA of those compromised wallets. Which means you couldn't just patch the device and call it a day. Victims had to follow a strict 3-step survival guide. First, update to the patched firmware to fix the random number generator. Second, generate a brand new master key entirely from scratch. And finally, physically broadcast transactions to sweep all their assets out of the compromised addresses into the newly generated secure ones. To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a pretty provocative thought about the very foundation of digital ownership. We're often sold on hardware wallets as these foolproof, unbreakable metal fortresses. But a $38 million exploit like this forces us to step back and ask, if an air-gapped device is ultimately only as secure as the human-written code generating its keys inside, what are the true hidden risks of long-term self-custody? We put immense trust in the math, but as we just saw, sometimes the math is bypassed by a single tiny coding error. Thanks for diving into this with me, and definitely keep questioning the systems that secure your digital world.